Hello, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Do we understand the economics and geopolitics of energy security? Brenda Schaefer is a professor at the US Naval Postgraduate School. She recently spoke on this topic at the Canada Strong and Free conference in Ottawa, and I want to welcome you to Boom and Bust.
Thank you so much.
I guess my first question is, what does energy security mean to you?
Well, I think there's three elements of energy security. One is reliability, meaning that the energy is there when you need it. The second is affordability, which means that it allows economic growth. And the third is sustainability, meaning that it doesn't have high impact on the environment, public health, other public goods that are important to societies. Of course, different countries, different communities maybe prioritize them in different ways, but if you have one and not the other, you really cannot have a modern economy, modern lifestyle. For instance, if you just go for just reliability, but you forget about or sustainability and forget about affordability, for a long time, your publics are not going to allow this form of energy use.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point that this is kind of for any modern economy to not talk about or to plan for energy security, really, it's a non-starter, isn't it?
Right. I mean, so many of the slogans that we hear all the time are just built on complete myths. I mean, literally complete myths. For instance, energy transition. Energy transition means growing use of renewable energy and declining use of fossil fuels. If you ask most people, are we in the middle of an energy, most people in the West, at least, certainly in Canada, are we in the midst of an energy transition? They would say yes. Even if you ask most of the AIs, are we in the midst of an energy transition?
Mm.
The reality is, in the 1970s, when we started this journey of alternative energy and started subsidizing and investing in it, we were using about 84% fossil fuels in the globe. Today, Tony, what do you think? Where are we at?
I
86.5%.
I didn't know whether it was
Sorry.
going to be the same or lower, but you're saying it's higher.
It's higher. So we've invested trillions of dollars, policy efforts, and still we don't have, we've made no progress. Now, actually, I shouldn't use the word progress
Mm.
because I don't see why there's any reason why we would want to not be using fossil fuels. Life expectancy on the globe has came out doubled, since the beginning of the fossil fuel era. We've eradicated most childhood illnesses. We've eradicated, or not eradicated, but we've highly reduced global poverty. We only have serious global poverty in places that actually do not have energy access, meaning that energy poverty leads to general poverty. When we've tried, like the G7, with Canada enthusiastic as part of these policies, or the World Bank, to dry up finance for fossil fuels around the world, we don't help the climate. All we do is actually keep poor people away from energy access. So because of our international energy policies, for the first time in decades, we
Mhm.
have a retreat in the amount of the global poor, or global people in general, that have energy access. So people in Ontario, in Montreal, can walk around, feel really good that their country doesn't support loans or for fossil fuels around the world. But it doesn't mean that anyone's cold in Manitoba. It just means that someone in Africa doesn't get to have electricity.
What does China, for instance, understand about energy security that we do not then?
Right. So, China actually, you have to give them credit for their climate and energy policies. China's convinced the West that there's a huge climate emergency, and we have to curtail using fossil fuels. So we do that in the West, while China surges ahead also India, with more and more fossil fuel use, especially coal use. China consumes more coal than all other countries together in the world. And with that coal fire, it produces electric cars, it produces wind towers, solar panels, solar
Mhm.
inverters. So we import those goods because China tells us that it's important to do for the planet, which China, which China is using coal fire
Right.
to produce. We import those coal fired products, and gain our dependence or increase our dependence on China.
On
And
yeah.
well, China itself doesn't reduce its emissions. I think one of
On
the
that
funniest
note,
things is like,
yeah, no, on that note, we are gonna take a little break, but we'll continue this discussion, very important one. We'll be back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. My guest is Professor Brenda Schaefer. She is at the US Naval Postgraduate School. Professor, we were just talking about sort of China and how it sees energy security and doing things in a very different way than the West. Can you continue with your analysis of that, please?
right. So you see frequently in Western media, organizations like the International Energy Agency that are supposed to promote energy security of the West, great exclamations about the increase of the use of electric vehicles in Canada and in China, as if that's a wonderful thing. Well, the majority of the electricity in China is produced from coal. So electric vehicles are actually coal-fired vehicles. I call
Hmm.
Chinese electric vehicles not EVs, but CVs, coal vehicles.
Right.
So electricity is a product; it's not a fuel source, right? So it seems to us very clean. It doesn't when you turn it on, you don't smell anything, you don't see anything, right? But in China, it's mostly produced from coal. So the sort of idea that there's something, from their perspective, coal is homegrown. Oil is foreign. Of course, it makes sense from energy security to move from gasoline-fired cars to coal-fired sorry, electricity-fired cars. But it doesn't do anything to help the climate.
Right, right. Gotcha, gotcha. Good point. At the conference that you spoke at in Ottawa, you mentioned 5 myths propagated by the West's adversaries to sort of hobble our abilities to compete. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Right. Well, and thank you for remembering the point. Um, myth number one, as I pointed out before, myth number one, we're in the midst of an energy transition, the energy transition, capital T. You keep hearing about it. No, the amount of fossil fuels in our global fuel mix is growing. Most recent data from Energy Institute puts it at 86% of global energy. 86% of global energy. The second myth, and we hear this also in response to the current Hormuz crisis. If we just could get off of fossil fuels, we wouldn't have any more problems with geopolitics of energy. So I tell you, would you really want to change about 20 major oil producers, about over 20 major natural gas producers, and Canada among them, one of the world's leaders in both, with one supplier, China, of most of the hardware for renewable energy. So clearly that there's much more, risk, geopolitical risk, from using today's renewable energy than there is from today's from fossil fuels. We should, in fact, and this is connected to the one of the next, the next myths, that this current energy crisis is due to the U.S. Israel-Iran war. The 2022 energy crisis in Europe was due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No,
Mm,
these things are always going to happen. There's going to be geopolitical challenges, changes. There's going to be tsunamis. There's going to be technological glitches. There's going to be earthquakes, right? We need to prepare. You started out, Tony, with energy security. We
right.
need to always prepare our markets and for how we use energy in a way that has redundancies, backups. And one of the things that we did for most of the post World War II period, up to about a decade or decade and a half ago, is we were constantly encouraging production of energy outside the Middle East. So whether that was Canada and the United States, but that was also the Caspian, like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Africa, any new sources, because we could look at a map. You could always see that straight. It wasn't even essentially about Iran. Any major resources should not be behind any choke point, whether it's
Right.
the Red Sea, whether it's Malacca, whether it's Hormuz, whether it's the Turkish Straits in the Black Sea. We knew this for decades, but suddenly people convinced us that we're in the middle of an energy transition and we don't need to develop these energy sources. One of the best examples is the 2010s. We had the world's biggest and most natural gas developments, discoveries were in Africa. Most of these were never went into production
Mm,
because the West, the G7, the World Bank dried up loans for fossil fuels. Africa is dependent on loans, so we could have been having today, a much easier crisis if we had, for instance, those five more natural gas fields and three oil fields in production in Africa. If we had the second wave of Caspian energy gas
right.
from Azerbaijan, for instance, we many of things that we used to do. If we had more pipeline capacity in Canada, getting to the west coast, and we had, I mean, what Canada is doing for the global market right now is very important
Right.
and is contributing to alleviating the crisis, but it could be doing more.
Okay, I want to leave it at that. We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back after these messages. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. My guest is Professor Brenda Schaefer. She is at the US Naval Postgraduate School. Professor Schaefer, you were going through the five myths. I think there's a couple to go, so please proceed.
Right. So another one is that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel. You hear these, words thrown out. Grid parity. You see an auction for solar and wind, and it seems to be cheaper than the units of natural gas or certainly of nuclear power. But there's a lot of things we need to unpack here in evaluating the cost of renewable energy versus other sources in electricity. So one, you have to remove the subsidies, meaning that if a company can bid, give a low bid for solar because it's also getting multiple tax breaks or other subsidies from the government, that's not the true price that actually this company is bidding for at an auction. Second, mostly renewable energy is just required, most of our regulatory systems, just to produce the electrons, and other people, the utilities, which means you and I, the public, will pay for getting that electricity to homes and businesses. What a lot of people don't realize is that all the expenses of a grid, and most important, the expenses of a base load. Sorry to be a bit wonky here, but
Mm,
electricity is finicky. It doesn't
mhm.
it doesn't deal with the volatility of renewable energy. So you have to keep a second system of energy on standby just to keep your grid functioning. And that's a grid we certainly want functioning in winters in Canada. That's life or death, necessity that it's functioning. And so that's a cost that renewable energy doesn't pay, but generally more traditional sources like nuclear, like natural gas, do have to pay into the grid and pay for that base load. So it's kind of an unfair comparison. When they actually are compared in a fair way, we see that renewable is higher. And we see, for instance, in grids where there's high degrees of renewable energy on the grids, like in Spain, energy prices are higher than neighboring states. A last myth is that if Canada does net zero, if the UK does net zero, Europe does net zero, somehow this is going to help the climate. Well, it's actually a myth. Canada could shut down its economy. The United States could shut down its economy. Europe could shut down its economies. And if China, India, and most of their allies continue to forge ahead with coal, it completely wipes out, any of those sacrifices that the West is making.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a good contextual piece there. So I want to talk actually about you talked a little bit about Chinese propaganda and influence in our society. This is a big issue in America after President Trump's speech, but it's been a continuing issue in Canada of influence in our elections. So that was something that you did touch upon in your remarks in Ottawa. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, It's amazing how interconnected some of these threats are. I refer to it as the red, green, green alliance. So we have basically the communist and socialist forces, which are actually becoming, quite prominent in the United States.
Hmm.
Mayor of the largest and most important city in the United States is a we're going to have a wave of members of Congress that are literally outward, communists, right? And they have a coalition with an Islamicist. I don't say Islamic. I don't say necessarily Muslim people or Muslim religion, but
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
that use
It's an
Islam as
ideology.
a
Yeah,
as
yeah,
a as an ideology, as a mobilizing force, right? And green, although it's not so good for the environment, but basically the climate organizations that many of the climate organizations, if you look at, look carefully, even at Greenpeace Canada, many of the climate organizations in Canada, they're extremely pro-China. There's only a good word about China, even though again China is the world's biggest, not just emitter, but also polluter. The largest consumer of coal in the world. So pro-China, despite their record, anti-Israel. Like what is less than a quarter of 1% of all global emissions are from Israel, right? Israel's an innovator of in so many fields that
right.
increase water supplies, reduce pollution, reduce emissions, right? But somehow it's an enemy of the climate organizations,
Sure.
and a very anti-West. The whole colonialism. Every bad
Everything.
thing that's
Yeah,
ever happened in the
exactly.
world history, it's
So
the West, right? And
we're
so
gonna
so
I'm
basically,
gonna
I
cut
mean,
you.
there.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
You will continue that point, but we do have to go to commercial. We'll be back after these
sure.
messages. Yeah. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. My guest is Professor Brenda Schaefer. She is at the US Naval Postgraduate School. You were just finishing up talking a little bit about Israel. Please continue your thoughts.
So again, it's the red, green, green
Right.
alliance. You have truly political, political movements uniting the extreme left with this people that use political Islam as a mobilizing force. The other green, the so-called greens that use climate issue as a cash cow to get money for this bigger movement. We very anti-West. Everything that's ever bad that's happened on the planet is because of the West. Everything is good. It's the anti-West, and also this myth that somehow before fossil fuels, everything was just hunky dory on the planet. Animals and humans were living in peace. All nations were living in peace, and suddenly man came and brought the fossil fuels, and and everything changed. It's exactly the opposite. I think these people need to travel. If you've ever traveled to a place that doesn't have regular access to electricity, the first thing you notice is the smoke, the difficult
Absolutely.
smells from the burning of dung, wood, leaves, other biomass. You see the health degradation from this daily doses of smoke to women, children, everyone in the homes, and also lack of clean water. You see women that have to be water pumps, essentially going down to a river every day at a not necessarily a clean place. Fossil fuels cleans water, cleans the air. The reality is people need to use some source of energy. So if it's not fossil fuels, it's going to be burning biomass. It's going to be something else. And another one of these myths, you see that there's a recent conference in the Colombia, the country of Colombia, where representatives of countries were sitting around trying to plan how we get off of fossil fuels, as if today, by today's technology, we have you know, any other option beside
Mm,
fossil fuels.
right.
The only other option that we have would be nuclear, and of course, those same organizations are also against nuclear power. So
That's right.
basically, it's really a myth.
But it's interesting you mentioned that because it looks like President Trump is very, very supportive of nuclear power. He has issued a few executive orders in that regard, and also has really turned away from that ideology of net zero and electrification as the answer. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems that we have in the United States is that, every 4 years we have, almost every 4 years we have a very drastic change in our energy policy. So if you
Hmm.
think, under the Biden administration, diplomats, representatives of any U.S. agencies were not even allowed to discuss fossil fuels with foreign counterparts. Under Trump, it's drill, baby, drill, right? So it's not sustainable. And in fact, even part of the current crisis in Hormuz was caused, an element of it. I'm not saying the whole crisis, but an element of it was that Biden, in order to appeal to young voters, he stopped new permits for LNG exports in the United States.
Right.
So the U.S. was seen as an unreliable supplier. Japan, South Korea, increased their contracts with Qatar, and now they're stuck instead of having, these more volumes from the United States. So I think, every time we have this seesaw, it's very difficult for the United States. It's very difficult globally. It's one of the reasons I come to shows like yourselves, because I think
Hmm.
it's really important for, energy is the most traded good. It's the biggest input to most manufacturing. It's one of the biggest inputs into agriculture. If we don't get energy right, we can't get any major policy issue right. And I think our publics, unfortunately, are fed a lot of myths. Often, these myths are propagated by the enemies of the West,
Right. Right.
like China.
Right.
And the West isn't perfect, but I'd like to live in a world where the United States and Canada are two of the most powerful countries in the world, and
Hmm.
not a world where China is the most
Sure.
powerful country in the world, or Russia, or anyone else.
Well, I think you've made your case very forcefully. I really want to appreciate and thank you for appearing on my program today.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching today.